Hello, and welcome back to Baby Alice's stories. We now return to Snuff by Terry Pratchett, Part 4. Colonel Charles Augustus Makepeace had long ago, with the expertise of a lifelong strategist, decided to let Letitia have her way in all things. It saved so much trouble and left him able to potter around in his garden, take care of his dragons, and to occasionally go trout fishing, a pastime that he loved. He rented 1/2 mile of stream, but was sadly now finding it difficult to keep running fast enough. Nowadays he spent a lot of time in his library, working on the 2nd volume of his memoirs, keeping from under his wife's feet and not getting involved. Until this moment, he had been quite happy that she had the role of chairman of the magistrates, because it kept her away from home for hours at a time. He had never been very much of one for thinking in terms of good or bad, and guilty or not guilty. He had learned to think in terms of us and them, and dead and not dead. And therefore he wasn't exactly listening to the group sitting around the long table at the other end of the library, talking in worried voices, but nevertheless he couldn't help overhearing. She had signed that damn document. He ought to have tried to talk her out of it, but he knew where that would have ended. Commander Vimes. Okay, by all accounts the man was the sort to rush in, and maybe he did have a scrap with what's-his-name, the blacksmith, who wasn't too bad a cove in his way. Bit of a hothead, of course, but he made a damn good dragon prod only the other day at quite a reasonable price. Vimes. Not a killer, surely. That's one thing you learned in the military. You don't last long if you're a killer. Killing, as duty called, was another thing entirely. Letitia had listened to that unspeakable lawyer, and they had all agreed that it be signed simply because that wretched Rust fella wanted it. He opened this month's edition of Fang and Fire. Occasionally, somebody lowered their voice, which you couldn't help thinking was damn insulting, given that they were sitting in a chap's library, and especially when the chap hadn't been consulted. But he didn't protest. He had long ago learned not to protest, and so he kept his eyes focused on the pull-out feature on flame-retardant incubators, holding it in front of him as if to ward off evil. However, among the words he didn't hear were, "Of course, he only married her for her money, you know." That was his wife's voice. Then, "I heard she was desperate to find a husband." The curiously sharp tone of that voice identified its owner as Miss Pickings, who the colonel couldn't help noting as he stared grimly at a full-page advertisement for asbestos kennels, had clearly been in no hurry to find a husband herself. The colonel was, by inclination, a live-and-let-live personality, and frankly, if a gel wanted to go around with another gel who wears a shirt and tie, trains horses, and has a face like a bulldog licking vinegar off a thistle, then it was entirely her business. After all, he told himself, what about old Beefy Jackson, eh? Wore a dress every night in the mess, and rather flowery aftershave for a chap. But when the call to arms came, he could fight like a bloody demon. Funny old world. He tried to find his place on the page again, but was interrupted by the very Reverend Mauser. He never could get on with padres, couldn't see the point. I find it very suspicious that the Ramkin family have turned up here after so many years, don't you? I keep reading about Vimes in the newspaper. Not the kind of person you can imagine as simply taking a holiday. According to Gravid, he is known as Veterinary's Terrier, said Letitia. At the other end of the room, her husband thrust his head even deeper into his magazine so as not to snigger. Gravid? Who would call their child Gravid? No one who had ever kept dragons or fish, that was certain. Of course, there was such a thing as a dictionary. But then the old Lord Rust had never been the kind of man to open a book if he could help it. The Colonel tried to contemplate an article on the treatment of zigzag throat in older males, and the wife of his heart continued. Well, we don't want any of Veterinary's nonsense here. Apparently, his lordship rather enjoys allowing Vimes to break wind in the halls of the mighty. Apparently, Vimes is no respecter of rank. Indeed, quite the reverse. And indeed, it would seem that he is prepared to ambush a decent working man. Funny, thought the Colonel. First time I ever heard her call the Smiths anything other than a blasted nuisance. It seemed to him that the gossip around the table was trite, artificial, like the conversation of raw recruits on the eve of their first battle. He thought, there's a warrant out for Commander Vimes, hero of Combe Valley. Bloody good show, wonderful execution, peace in our time between Brother Troll and Brother Dwarf and that sort of thing. Just the job. I've seen too much killing in my time. And now you are going to put him out of a job and a reputation just because that greasy lad with a name like a pregnant frog has charmed you into doing so. I understand he has a very violent nature, said, what was his name? Bit of a bad hat in the Colonel's opinion. Bought a big villa up near Overhang, one of Rust's cronies. Never seemed to do any work. What was his name? Ah, yes, Edgehill. Not a man that you would trust behind you or in front of you, but they'd sworn him in even so. And he was just a street kid and a drunkard, said Letitia. What do you think of that? The Colonel paid careful attention to his magazine while his unspoken thought said, Sounds jolly good to me, my dear. All I got when I married you was the promise of a half share in your dad's fish and chip shop when I left the service, and I never even got that. Everybody knows that his ancestor killed a king, so I can't imagine a Vimes would jib at killing a blacksmith, said the Honourable Ambrose. Bit of a mystery, this one. Something to do with shipping. Sent out from the city to lie low here because of something to do with a girl. And the Colonel, who spent a lot of time thinking, footnote, because he wasn't allowed much time talking, end footnote. And the Colonel, who spent a lot of time thinking, had some time ago wondered to himself how, in these modern days, you got banished from the city because of a girl. And instinct had told him that possibly it had something to do with the age of the girl. After incubating that thought for a while, the Colonel had written to his old chum Jankers Robinson, who always knew a thing or two about this and that, and one thing and another, and who was now some political walla in the palace. Walla, a person who is associated with a particular work or who performs a specific duty or service, usually used in combination. Walla, W-A-L-L-A-H, Walla. After incubating that thought for a while, the Colonel had written to his old chum Jankers Robinson, who always knew a thing or two about this and that, and one thing and another, and who was now some political waller in the palace. He had made an inquiry, as one might, of his friend whom he had once dragged to safety over the pummel of his saddle before a Clachan scimitar got him, and had received a little note with nothing more than, "Yes, indeed, under age, hushed up at great expense." And after that the Colonel had taken great care never to shake the bastard's hand again. Blithely unaware of the thoughts of the Colonel, the Honourable Ambrose, who always seemed to be slightly bigger than his clothes, said clothes being of a fashion more suited to somebody 20 years his junior, sneered. "Frankly, I think we're doing the world a service. They say that he favours dwarves and all kinds of low life. You might expect anything of a man like that." "Yes, you might," thought the Colonel. And Miss Picking said, "But we haven't done anything wrong, have we?" The Colonel turned a page and smoothed it down with military exactitude. He thought, "Well, you all condone smuggling when the right people are doing it because they're chums, and when they aren't, they're heavily fined. You apply one law for the poor and none for the rich, my dear, because the poor are such a nuisance." He felt eyes suddenly upon him because marital telepathy is a terrible thing. His wife said, "It doesn't do any harm. Everybody does it." Her head swung round again as her husband turned the page. His eyes fixedly on the type as he thought, as noiselessly as his brain could contrive. "And of course, there was the incident a few years ago. Not good, that. Not good. Not good when little babies of any sort are taken away from mothers. Not good at all. And you all know it, and it worries you, and well it should." The room was silent for a moment, and then Mrs. Colonel continued, "There will not be any problems. Young Lord Rust has promised me. We have rights, after all." "I blame that wretched blacksmith," said Miss Pickings. "He keeps bringing it back into people's memories. Him and that damn writing woman." Mrs. Colonel bridled at this. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Miss Pickings. Legally, nothing wrong has happened here." Her head swiveled toward her husband. "Are you all right, dear?" she demanded. For a moment he looked as though he wasn't, and then the Colonel said, "Oh, yes, dear. Right as rain, right as rain." But his thoughts continued. "You have partaken in what is, I strongly suggest, a cynical attempt to ruin the career of a very good man." "I heard you coughing." It sounded like an accusation. "Oh, just a bit of dust or something, dear. Right as rain, right as rain." And then he slammed his magazine onto the table. Standing up, he said, "When I was nothing but a subaltern." Subaltern, particular with reference to a related universal proposition, or subordinate, subaltern. "When I was nothing but a subaltern, dear, one of the first things I learned was that you never give away your position by frantic firing. I think I know the type of your Commander Vimes. Young Lord Rust may be safe with his money and contacts, but I doubt very much that you all will be. Who knows what would have happened if you hadn't been so hasty? What's a bit of smuggling? You've just pulled the dragon's tail and made him angry." When his wife regained control of her tongue, she said, "How dare you, Charles?" "Oh, quite easy, as it turns out, dear," said the Colonel, smiling happily. "A bit of smuggling might be considered a peccadillo." Peccadillo. A slight offence. Peccadillo.
A bit of smuggling might be considered a peccadillo, but not when you're supposed to be upholding the law. It baffles me that none of you seems to realize that. If you have any sense, ladies and gentlemen, you will explain that whole unfortunate goblin event to His Grace right now. After all, your chum Gravid organized it. The only little problem is that you allowed him to do it, as I recall, without so much as a murmur.
But it was not illegal, said his wife icily. Her husband didn't move, but in some ineffable sense he was suddenly taller.
I think things got a bit tangled. You see, you thought about things as being legal or illegal. Well, I'm just a soldier, and never was a very good one. But it's my opinion you were so worried about legal and illegal that you never stopped to think about whether it was right or wrong. And now, if you will excuse me, I'm going down to the pub.
Automatically, his wife said, No, dear. You know drink doesn't agree with you. The Colonel was all smiles.
This evening, I intend to settle my differences with drink and make it my friend.
The rest of the magistrates looked at Mrs. Colonel, who glared at her husband. I'll talk to you about this later, Charles, she growled. To her surprise, his smile did not change.
Yes, dear, I suspect you will. But I think you'll find that I won't be listening. Good evening to you all.
There was a click as the door shut behind him. There should have been a slam, but some doors never quite understand the situation. The goblin was already moving quite fast, with a dot and carry one gait that was deceptively speedy. Dot and carry one is a rather dated British figurative phrase for a person with a limp. Dot carry one. The goblin was already moving quite fast, with a dot and carry one gait that was deceptively speedy. Vimes was surprised to find that Feeney made heavy weather of the little jog toward, he was not surprised, Hangman's Hill. He could hear the boy wheezing slightly. Perhaps you didn't need to be all that fast to overtake a wayward pig, but you needed to be very fast indeed to catch up with a young troll blizzarded to the eyeballs with slice, and you needed lots of stamina to overtake him and slap the cuffs on him before he came down enough to try to twist your head off. Policing was obviously very different in the country. In the country, there is always somebody watching you, he thought as they sped along. Well, there was always somebody watching you in the city too, but that was generally in the hope that you might drop dead and they could run off with your wallet. They were never interested. But here, he thought, he could feel many eyes on him. Maybe they belonged to squirrels or badgers or whatever the damn things were that Vimes heard at night. Gorillas, possibly. He had no idea what he was going to see, but certainly didn't expect to find the top of the hill bright with lines of rope painted yellow. He gave it only a second's glance, however. With their backs to one of the trees and looking very apprehensive were 3 goblins. One of them stood up, thus bringing its head and therefore its eyes to a level in the vicinity of Vimes's groin. Not a good position to find himself. It held up a wrinkled hand and said, "Vimes, hang!" Vimes stared down at it and then at Feeney. "What does he mean, hang?" "Never been quite sure," said Feeney. Something like, have a nice day, I think, but only in Goblin.
Vimes,
the old goblin continued.
It said you be policeman. It be big policeman. If policeman, then just ice. But just ice it be no. And when dark inside dark, dark moving, dark must come Vimes. Dark rises, just ice.
Vimes had no idea of the sex of the speaker or even its age. Dress wasn't a clue. Goblins apparently wore anything that could be tied on. Its companions were watching him unblinkingly. They had stone axes, flint, vicious stuff, but it lost its edge after a couple of blows, which was no consolation when you were bleeding from the neck. He had heard that they were berserk fighters too. Oh, and what was the other thing people said? Ah, yes. Whatever you do, don't let them scratch you. You want justice, do you? Justice for what? The goblin speaker stared at him and said,
Come with me, policeman.
the words rolling out like a curse, or at least a threat. The speaker turned and began to walk solemnly down the far side of the hill. The other 3 goblins, including the one known to Vimes as Stinky, did not move. Feeney whispered,
This could be a trap, sir.
Vimes rolled his eyes and sneered. You think so, do you? I thought it was probably an invitation to a magical show featuring the amazing Bonko and Doris and the collapsing unicycle brothers with Fido the cat. What's this yellow rope all about, Mr. Upshot? Police cordon, sir. My mum knitted it for me. Oh, yes. I can see she's managed to work the word plice in black and there several times too. Yes, sir. Sorry about the spelling, sir, said Feeney, clearly spooked by the stares. He went on. There was blood all over the ground, sir, so I scraped some into a clean jam jar just in case. Vimes paid that no attention, because the 2 goblin guards had unfolded and were standing up. Stinky beckoned Vimes to walk ahead of them. Vimes shook his head, folded his arms, and turned to Feeney. Let me tell you what you thought, Mr. Upshot. You acted on information received, didn't you? And you heard that the blacksmith and I indulged in a bout of fisticuffs outside the pub the other night. And that is true. No doubt you were also told that at some time later someone heard a conversation in which he arranged to meet me up at this place. Yes? Don't bother to answer. I can see it in your face. You haven't quite got the copper's deadpan yet. Has Mr. Jefferson gone missing? Feeney gave up. Yes, Mr. Vimes. He didn't deserve, or perhaps he did deserve, the force with which Vimes turned on him. You will not call me Mr. Vimes, lad. You ain't earned the right. You call me Sir, or Commander, or even Your Grace, if you're dumb enough to do so. Understand? I could have sent the blacksmith home walking very strangely if I'd had a mind to do so the other night. He's a big man, but no street hero. But I let him get the steam out of his tubes and calm down without losing face. Yes, he did say he wanted to meet me up here last night. When I came up here with a witness, there was blood on the ground, which I will warrant is goblin blood, and certainly no sign of any blacksmith. You had a bloody stupid case against me when you came up to my house, and it's still a bloody stupid case. Any questions? Feeney looked down at his feet. No, sir. Sorry, sir. Good. I'm glad. Think of this as a training experience, my lad, and it won't cost you a penny. Now, these goblins seem to want us to follow them, and I intend to do so. And I also intend that you will come with me. Understood? Vimes looked at the two goblin guards. An axe was waved in a half-hearted sort of way, indicating that they should indeed be travelling. They set off, and he could hear sorrowful Feeny trying to be brave, but broadcasting anxiety. They're not going to touch us, kid. First, because if they had intended to do that, they'd have done it already. And second, they want something from me. Feeny moved a little closer. And what would that be, sir? Justice, said Vimes. And I think I have a premonition about what that is going to mean. Sometimes people asked Commander Vimes why Sergeant Cullen and Corporal Nobbs were still on the strength, such as it was of the modern Ankh-Morpork City Watch, given that Nobby occasionally had to be held upside down and shaken to reclaim small items belonging to other people, while Fred Cullen had actually cultivated the ability to walk his beat with his eyes closed and end up, still snoring, back at Sidopolis Yard, sometimes with graffiti on his breastplate. To Lord Veterinary, Commander Vimes had put forward 3 defences. The first was that both of them had an enviable knowledge of the city and its inhabitants, official and otherwise, that rivaled Vimes's own. The second was the traditional urinary argument. It was better to have them inside pissing out than outside pissing in. It was at least easy to keep an eye on them. And not least, oh my word, not least, they were lucky. Many a crime had been solved because of things that had fallen on them, tried to kill them, tripped one of them up, been found floating in their lunch, and in one case had tried to lay its eggs up Nobby's nose. And so it was that, today, whatever god or other force it might be that regarded them as its playthings directed their steps to the corner of Cheapside and Rhyme Street and the fragrant emporium of Bewilderforce Gumption. Footnote. The fourth gumption to run the tobacco house and snuff mill felt that his surname lacked prestige, and for some reason chose the name Bewilderforce, which did indeed become prestigious owing to the success of his tobacco enterprise, which was extremely well thought of by the gentry and others. And thereafter there was at least one Bewilderforce in every generation of the line, although girls were generally named Bewildred. End footnote. Sergeant Cullen and Corporal Nobbs, as is the way with policemen, entered the building by the back door, and were greeted by Mr. Gumption with that happy but somewhat glassy smile with which a trader greets an old acquaintance who he knows will end up getting merchandise with a discount of 100%.
Why, Fred! How nice to see you again,
he said, while awakening the mystic third eye developed by all small shopkeepers, especially those who see Nobby Nobbs coming into the shop.
We were patrolling the area, Bewilderforce, and I thought I'd drop in to get my tobacco and see how you were managing with all this fuss about the tax and everything.
The sergeant had to speak up to be heard above the rumbling of the snuff mill and the carts that were moving across the factory floor in a stream. Rows of women at tables were packing snuff, and here he leaned sideways to get a better view. The cigarette production line was also a bustle. Sergeant Cullen looked around. Policemen always look on the basis that there is always something to see. Of course, sometimes they may find it sensible to forget that they have seen anything, at least officially. Mr. Gumption had a new tie pin, in which a diamond flashed. His shoes were also clearly new, bespoke if Fred Cullen was any judge, and a barely noticeable sniff suggested the wearing of, let's say now,
Oh yes, cedar fragrance, pour home. From Quirm at $15 a pop.
he said.
How's business doing? Is the new tax hitting you at all?
Mr. Gumption's visage flew into the expression of a hard-working man, solely pressed by the machinations of politics and fate. He shook his head sadly.
We're barely making ends meet, Fred. Lucky to break even at the end of the day.
Oh, and a gold tooth too,
Thought Sergeant Cullen.
I nearly missed that.
Out loud he said,
I'm very sorry to hear that, Bewilderforce. I really am. Allow me to raise your profit by expending $2 in the purchase of my usual 3 ounces of twist tobacco.
Fred Cullen proffered his wallet, and Mr. Gumption, with a scolding noise, waved it away. It was a ritual as old as merchants and policemen, and it allowed the world to keep on turning. He cut a length of tobacco from the coil on the marble counter, wrapped it quickly and expertly, and as an afterthought, reached down and came up with a large cigar, which he handed to the sergeant.
Try one of these handsome smokes, Fred. Just in, not local, made on the plantation for our valued customers. No, my pleasure, I insist, he added as Fred made grateful noises. Always nice to see the watch in here, you know that.
Actually, Mr. Gumption thought, as he watched the departing policeman, that was pretty mild. All that the Nobs creature had done was stare around.
They must be coining it,
said Nobby Nobs as they ambled onward.
Did you see the staff wanted note in their window? And he was writing out a list of prices on the counter. He's lowering them. He must have a good deal going on with the plantation people. That's all I can say.
Sergeant Cullen sniffed the big fat cigar, the fattest he had ever seen, which smelled so good it was probably illegal, and he felt the tingle, the feeling that he had walked into something that was a lot bigger than it seemed. The feeling that if you pulled a thread, something large would unravel. He rolled the cigar between his fingers the way he had seen connoisseurs do. In truth, Sergeant Cullen was, when it came to tobacco products, something of a bottom feeder, cheapness being the overriding consideration, and the protocol of cigars was unfamiliar to a man who very much enjoyed a good length of chewing tobacco. What was the other thing he had seen posh types do? Oh yes, you had to roll it in your fingers and hold it up to your ear. He had no idea why this had to be done, but he did it anyway. And swore. And dropped it on the ground. The track from the top of Hangman's Hill went beyond the trees and down, mostly through firs, bushes, and rocky outcrops, with the occasional patch of raw and useless soil. All substance eroded away. Wild land, wasteland, home to skinny rabbits, hopeless mice, the occasional concussed rat, and goblins. And there among the bushes was the entrance to a cave. A human would have to bend double to get into that fetid hole and would be an easy target. But Vimes knew, as he ducked through, that he was safe. He knew that. He had suspected it out in the daylight, and down in the darkness he knew. The knowledge was almost physical as wings of darkness spread over him, and he heard the sounds of the cave. Every sound. He suddenly knew the cave, all the way down to the place where water could be found, the fungus and mushroom gardens, the pathetically empty storerooms, and the kitchen. These were human translations, of course. Goblins generally ate where they could and slept where they fell asleep. They had no real concept of a room with one particular purpose. He knew this now as if he had known it all his life, and he had never before been in any place that a goblin would call home. But this was the dark, and Vimes in the dark had an understanding, didn't they? At least that's what the dark thought. What Vimes thought, unprosaically, was,
damn, here we go again.
Unprosaically, meaning in a manner that is not dull, ordinary, or unimaginative, or not in the ordinary, straightforward way of prose. It describes something done in an interesting, poetic, or imaginative way, the opposite of prosaically, unprosaically. At least, that's what the dark thought. What Vimes thought unprosaically was, damn, here we go again. He was prodded into the small of his back, and he heard Feeney gasp. Vimes turned to a grinning goblin and said,
"Try that one more time, sunshine, and I'll give you a smack around the head. Understand?"
And that was what he said, and that was what he heard himself say, except that something, not exactly another voice, climbed along his words like a snake coiling itself around a tree, and both his guards dropped their weapons and bolted back into the daylight. It was instant. They didn't yelp or shout. They wanted to save their breath for running.
"Great hells, Commander Vimes! That was bloody magical!"
said Feeney as he bent to grope for the fallen axes. Vimes watched in the thick darkness as he saw the boy's hands scrambling and, by luck, finding them.
"Drop them! I said drop them right now!"
"But we're unarmed!"
"Don't you bloody argue with me, boy!"
There were a couple of thumps as the axes hit the ground. Thunk, thunk. Vimes breathed again.
"Now, we're going to see that nice senior goblin. You understand? And we walk without fear because we are the law. You understand? And the law can go everywhere in pursuit of its inquiries."
The headroom increased as they walked onward, until Vimes was able to stand fully upright. Feeney, on the other hand, was having difficulties. Behind Vimes there was a chorus of thumps, scrapes, and words that dear old mums should not know about, let alone hear. Vimes had to stop and wait for the boy to catch up. Stubbing his feet on easily avoidable outcrops and banging his head where the ceiling dipped briefly.
"Come on, Chief Constable!"
Vimes shouted.
"A copper should have good night vision. You should eat more carrots with your bang sung suck dog or whatever."
"It's pitch black, sir. I can't see my hand in front of my face. Ouch!"
Feeney had walked directly into Vimes. Light dawned, although not on Feeney. Vimes looked around the meandering cave. It was lit as if by daylight. There were no torches, no candles, just a pervading, moderately bright light. The light he had seen before, years ago now, in a cave, a big cave, far away, and he knew what it meant. He was seeing darkness, probably better than the goblins did. The dark had become incredibly light on that day when Vimes, underground, had fought creatures, walking, speaking creatures, that made their home away from the light and had hatched dark plans. But Vimes had fought them, and he had won, And because of that, the Coombe Valley Accord had been written and signed, and the oldest war in the world had ended in, if not peace, then a place where the seeds of peace could hopefully be planted. It was good to know that, because out of the darkness, Vimes had acquired a companion. The dwarves had one name for it, the Summoning Dark, and they had any amount of explanations for what it was. A demon, a lost god, a curse, a blessing, vengeance made flesh, except that it had no flesh other than the flesh it borrowed. A law unto itself, a killer, but sometimes a protector, or something that no one could find the right words for. It could travel through rock, water, air, and flesh, and for all Vimes knew, through time. After all, what limits can you put on a creature made of nothing? Yes, he had met it, and when they parted for amusement, playfulness, mischief, or simply reward, the Summoning Dark had put its mark on him, drifting through him and leaving that little glowing tattoo. Vimes pulled up his shirt sleeve, and there it was. It seemed to be brighter. Sometimes he met it in dreams, where they nodded at one another in respect, and then went their separate ways. Months, even years might pass between meetings, and he might think it had gone for good, but its mark was on his forearm. Sometimes it itched. All in all, it was like having a nightmare on a leash, and now it was giving him sight in the darkness. But hold on, this was a goblin burrow, not a dwarf cave. And his own thoughts came right back at him with that slight overtone, as if they were a duet. Yes, but goblins steal everything, Commander. Right here and now it appeared that goblins had stolen away. The floor of the cave was covered with debris, rubbish, and things that presumably goblins thought were important, which would probably mean everything, bearing in mind they religiously collected their own snot. He could see the old goblin beckoning him to follow before disappearing. There was a door ahead of him, of goblin manufacture, and was borne out by its look of rottenness and the fact that it was hanging by one hinge, which broke when Vimes gave the door a push. Behind him, Feeny said, "What was that? Please, sir, I can't see a thing." Vimes walked across to the boy and tapped him on the shoulder, causing him to jump. "Mr. Upshot, I'll take you up to the entrance so that you can go home, okay?" He felt the boy shudder. "No, sir. I'd rather stay with you, if it's all the same to you. Please." "But you can't see in the dark, lad." "I know, sir. I've got some string in my pocket. My granddad said a good copper should always have a piece of string." His voice was trembling. "It is generally useful, yes," said Vimes, carefully picking it out of the boy's pocket. "It's amazing how helpless a suspect can be with his thumbs tied together. Are you sure you wouldn't feel better up in the fresh air?" "Sorry, sir, but if it's all the same to you, I think the safest place to be right now is behind you, sir." "You really can't see a thing, lad?" "Not a blessed thing, sir. It's like I've gone blind, sir." In Vimes's opinion, the young man was about to go postal, and maybe tethering him to Vimes was better than hearing him knock himself out in an attempt to flee. "You're not blind, lad. It's just that all that night duty I've done, well, it looks as if I'm better than I thought I seen in the dark." Feeny shuddered again at Vimes's touch, but together they succeeded in linking Chief Constable Upshot to Vimes with about 6 feet of hairy string, which smelled of pig. There were no goblins behind the broken door, but a fire was smouldering fitfully, with a piece of blessedly unrecognizable meat on a spit above it. A man might think that a goblin had found a reason to leave his tea behind in a hurry. And talking of tea, there was a pot, which was to say a rusty tin can, bubbling in the embers of the fire. Vimes sniffed at it, and was surprised that it smelled of bergamot, and somehow the idea of a goblin drinking posh tea with his pinky extended managed, temporarily, to overwhelm his incongruity functions. Bergamot, a round to pear-shaped citrus fruit of Mediterranean tree that has yellow to green rind, which yields a bitter, fragrant essential oil, and that is typically considered to be a hybrid of a sour orange and a lemon. Bergamot. Vimes sniffed at it and was surprised that it smelled of bergamot, and somehow the idea of a goblin drinking posh tea with his pinky extended managed, temporarily, to overwhelm his incongruity functions. Well, it grew, didn't it? And goblins probably got thirsty, didn't they? Nothing to worry about, although if he found a plate of delicate biscuits, he would definitely have to sit down and rest. He walked on, the light never failing, goblins never appearing. The cave complex certainly sloped downward, and there were still signs of goblins everywhere, but of goblins themselves no sign, which in theory should be a good thing, given that generally the first sign of a goblin would be one landing on your head and trying to turn it into a bowling ball. And then there was a flash of colour in this drab subterranean landscape of ices and browns. It was a bunch of flowers, or what had been a bunch before it had been dropped. Vimes wasn't an expert on flowers, and when he bought them for Sybil at maritally advisable intervals, he generally stuck to a bunch of roses, or its seemingly acceptable equivalent, one single orchid. He was vaguely aware of the existence of other flowers, of course, which brightened up the place, to be sure, but he had never been one for the names. There were no roses here, no orchids either. These flowers had been plucked from hedgerows and meadows, and even included the scrawny plants that managed to hang on and flower in the wilderness up above. Someone had carried them. Someone had dropped them. Someone had been in a hurry. Vimes could read it in the flowers. They had fallen from somebody's open hand so that they spread back along their path like a comet tail. And then more than one person had trampled them underfoot, but probably not because they were chasing the aforesaid bouquet carrier, but by the look of it because they wanted to go the way that he or she had run, and even faster than he or she did. There had been a stampede, in fact. Scared people running away. But running away from what? You, Commander Vimes, you, the majesty of the law. See how I help you, Commander. The familiarity of the voice annoyed him. It sounded too much like his own voice. But I'm here because they wanted me to come, he said to the cave in general. I wasn't intending to fight anybody. And in his head, his own voice told him, Oh, my little ragtag rubbish people who do not trust and are not trusted. Tread with care, Mr. Policeman. The hated have no reason to love.
Oh, the strange and secret people, last and worst, born of rubbish, hopeless, bereft of God. The best of luck to you, my brother in darkness. Do what you can for them, Mr. Policeman. On Vimes's wrist, the sigil of the summoning dark glowed for a moment. I'm not your brother! Vimes shouted. I'm not a killer! The words echoed around the caves, but under them Vimes thought he felt something slithering away. Could something with no body slither? Gods damn the dwarves and their subterranean folklore!
Are you, all right, sir? Came the nervous voice of Feeny behind him. You were shouting, sir.
I was just cussing because I banged my head on the ceiling, lad, Vimes lied.
He had to deliver reassurance quickly before Feeny got so unnerved that he might try to make a break for the exit out of panic.
You're doing very well, Chief Constable.
Only, I don't like the dark, sir. Never have. Do you think anyone will worry if I have a wee up against the wall?
I should go ahead if I was you, lad. I don't think anything could make this place smell worse.
Vimes heard some vague sounds behind him, and then Feeny said in a damp little voice, Nature has taken its course, sir. Sorry, sir.
Vimes smiled to himself.
Don't worry, lad. You won't be the first copper to have to wring out his socks, and you won't be the last either. I remember the first time I had to arrest a troll. Big fellow he was, a very nasty character. I was a bit damp around the socks that day, and I don't mind admitting it. Think of it as a kind of baptism. Keep it jolly, he thought. Make a joke of it. Don't let him dwell on the fact that we're walking into the scene of a crime that he can't see. Funny thing, that troll is now my best sergeant, and I've relied on him for my life quite a few times. That just goes to show that you never know, although what it is we never know, I suspect we'll never know.
Vimes turned a corner, and there were the goblins. He was glad that young Feeny couldn't see them. Strictly speaking, Vimes wished he couldn't see them either. There must have been 100 of them, many of them holding weapons. They were crude weapons, to be sure, but a flint axe hitting your head does not need a degree in physics.
Have we got somewhere, sir? Said Feeny behind him. You've stopped walking.
They're just standing there, Vimes thought, as if they're on parade, just watching in silence, waiting for that silence to break. There are a few goblins in this cave, lad, and they're watching us.
After a few seconds of silence, Feeny said,
Could you tell me exactly what a few means, sir?
Dozens and dozens of owlish faces stared at Vimes without expression. If the silence was going to be broken by the word charge, then he and Feeny would be smears on the floor, which was pretty smeared as it was.
Why did I come in here? Why did I think it was a good thing to do? Oh well, the lad is a policeman after all, and it isn't as if he doesn't already have a clothing problem. He said, I would say there are about 100, lad, all heavily armed, as far as I can see, except for a couple of broken down ones right at the front. Could be chieftains, I suppose. Beards you could keep a rabbit in, and by the look of it, may have. It looks as if they are waiting for something.
There was a pause before Feeny said,
It's been an education working with you, sir.
Look, said Vimes, if I have to turn and run, just hang on, okay? Running is another skill a policeman sometimes needs.
He turned to the crowd of impassive goblins and said,
I am Commander Vimes of the Ankh-Morpork City Watch. How can I help you?
Just ice! The cry caused things to drop from the ceiling. It echoed around the cave and echoed again as cavern after cavern picked up the shout. Just ice! Just ice! Just ice! As cavern after cavern picked up the shout, spun it around and sent it back. Light rose as torches were kindled. It took Vimes a few moments to realize this, because the light he had seen, some curious artificial light that was probably in his head, had been brighter and mixed strangely with the smoky orange that was now filling the cave. Well, sir, it looks as though they're pleased to see us, yes? Feeney's relief and hope should have been bottled and sold to despairing people everywhere. Vimes just nodded, because the ranks were pulling apart, leaving a pathway of sorts, at the end of which there was, inarguably, a corpse. It was a mild relief to see that it was a goblin corpse, but no corpse is good news, particularly when seen in a grimy low light, and especially for the corpse. And yet something inside him exulted and cried, Hallelujah! Because here was a corpse, and he was a copper, and this was a crime, and this place was smoky and dirty, and full of suspicious-looking goblins, and here was a crime. His world. Yes, here was his world. In the Ankh-Morpork City Watch forensic laboratory, Igor was brewing coffee, to the accompaniment of distant rumblings, strange flashes of light, and the smell of electricity. At last he pulled the big red lever, and frothing brown liquid gurgled into a pot, to be subsequently delivered into 2 mugs, one of which carried the slogan, Egolth hists you up, while the other was emblazoned with Dwarves do it slightly lower down. He handed that one to Sergeant Sherry Littlebottom, whose previous experience as an alchemist meant that she sometimes did duty in the lab, but at this point the coziness of morning coffee was interrupted by Nobby Nobbs, towing Sergeant Colin behind him. The sergeant has had a bit of a shock, Eagle, so I thought you might be able to help him. Well, I could give him another one, Eagle volunteered as Fred Cullen slumped into a chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. The chair had straps on it. Look, said Nobby, I'm not mucking about. You've heard of the tobacco that counts? Well, he just had a cigar that cries. I've put it in this here evidence bag as per standing instructions. Sherry took the bag and peered inside. It's got egg sandwiches in it. Honestly, Nobby, has anyone explained to you what forensic means? On the basis that she probably couldn't make things actually worse, Sherry emptied the sandwiches onto the table, where they were joined by 1 cigar with mayonnaise. She wiped this down with some care and looked at it. Well, Nobby, I don't smoke, and I don't know much about cigars, but this one appears to be quite happy at the moment. You have to hold it to your ear, said Nobby helpfully. Sherry did so and said, All I can hear is the crinkling of the tobacco, which I suspect hasn't been properly kept. The dwarf held the cigar away from her face and looked at it suspiciously, and then wordlessly she handed it to Igor, who put it to his ear, or at least the one that he was currently using, because you never know with Igors. They looked at one another, and Igor broke the silence. There are such things, I believe, as tobacco weavers. I'm sure there are, said Sherry, but I doubt very much if they chuckle. Chuckle? It sounded to me like somebody crying, said Igor, as he squinted at the bulging cigar and added, We should wash down the table and clean a scalpel and use the number 2 tweezers and 2. No, make that 4 sterilized surgical masks and gloves. It may be some kind of unusual insect in there. I held that cigar up to my ear, said Nobby. What kind of insect are we talking about? I'm not sure, said Igor. But generally, the places in the world where tobacco is cultivated are known for some remarkably dangerous ones. For example, the yellow grass weaver of Howandaland has been known to enter the skull via the ears, lay its eggs in the victim's brain, and leave the poor victim hallucinating continuously until it has exited via the nostrils. Death inevitably ensues. My cousin Igor has a tank full of them. They're very good at getting skulls scrupulously clean. Igor paused. So I'm told that is, although I personally cannot confirm that. He paused again, then added, Of course. Nobby Nobbs headed for the door, but unusually, Sergeant Cullen did not follow his friend. Instead, he said,
I'll just stay with my fingers in my ears if it's all the same to you.
He craned his head to watch as Igor carefully pulled the cigar apart and said conversationally, They say that the cigars made in foreign parts are rolled on the thighs of young women. Personally, I call that disgusting. There was a tinkle and a glint. Footnote. A glint is, in fact, a visual tinkle. End footnote. There was a tinkle and a glint, and something dropped onto the table. Sherry leaned cautiously forward. It looked like a small, expensive vial for the most delicate alchemical experiments, and yet, she thought later, it seemed to have movement in it. Movement while staying still. Igor looked over her shoulder and said, Oh! They looked at the vial in silence that was soon broken by Sergeant Cullen.
That looks shiny, he said. Is it worth anything?
Sherry Littlebottom raised her eyebrows at Igor, who shrugged. He said, Priceless, I should think. If you could find the buyer with enough money and the, how shall I put it, right taste in ornamentation. It's an undue pot, said Sherry carefully. A goblin ceremonial pot, Sarge. The dawn of understanding began to flow across Sergeant Cullen's gas giant of a face.
Ain't they the things they make to store all their piss and shit in?
He said, backing away. Igor cleared his throat and looked at Sherry as he said icily, Not this type, if I'm right, and at least not down here on the plains. Those that feel themselves protected in the high mountains make pots and also use the undue brushes, and of course the undue masks. He looked expectantly, but without any real hope, at the sergeant. Sherry, who had known him for longer, said, I understand, Sarge, that the goblins on the plains think the ones in the mountains are rather strange. As for this pot, she hesitated, I rather fear that this is a particularly special one.
Well, it looks like the little buggers got that right,
said Fred cheerfully, and to Sherry's horror, he snatched up the tiny pot.
It's mine, that's why. Far too good for a stinking goblin. But how come it makes a noise?
Sergeant Littlebottom looked at Igor's expression, and to prevent trouble in the forensic department, she grabbed the sergeant's arm and dragged him out of the door, slamming it behind him. Sorry about this, Sergeant, but I could see that Igor was becoming a little bit agitated.
Sergeant Cullen brushed himself down with as much dignity as he could muster and said,
If it's valuable, then I want it. Thank you so very much. After all, it was given to me in good faith, right?
Well, of course that is so, Sergeant, but you see, it already belongs to a goblin.
Sergeant Cullen burst out laughing.
Them? What have they got to own apart from being piles of crap?
Sherry hesitated. Lazy and bombastic as Fred Cullen was, the record showed that against all apparent evidence, he had been a helpful and useful officer. She needed to be tactful.
Sergeant, can I say right now that I appreciate all the help you have given to me since I arrived in Sidopolis Yard? I'll always remember you pointing out to me all those places where a watchman could stand out of the wind and the worst of the rain. And I definitely committed to memory the list of public houses who would be generous to a thirsty copper after hours. And indeed, I remember you telling me that a copper should never take a bribe, and why a meal was not a bribe. I cherish your approval, Sergeant, since I know that by upbringing, you are not particularly happy about women in the watch, and especially when one of those women is of the dwarf persuasion. I realize that in the course of your long career, you have had to adapt your thinking to meet the new circumstances. Therefore, I'm proud to be a colleague of yours, Sergeant Cullen, and I hope you'll forgive me when I tell you that there are times when you should shut up and get some new ideas in that big fat head of yours rather than constantly reheating the old ones. You picked up a little trinket, Sergeant, and now it really is yours. More yours than I think you can possibly imagine. I wish I could tell you more, but I only know what the average dwarf knows about goblins. I don't know too much about this type of undue pot, but I think, given the floral decoration and its small size, that it is the one they call the Soul of Tears, Sergeant. And I think you have made your life suddenly very interesting because... Can I ask you to put it down for just one moment, please? I promised most sincerely that I won't take it away from you.
Cullen's somewhat piggy eyes looked at Sherry suspiciously, but he said,
Well, if it gives you any satisfaction...
He went to put the pot on the nearby windowsill, and she saw him shake his hand.
Seems to be stuck on.
Sherry thought to herself, So it's true. Out loud, she said, I'm very sorry to hear that, Sergeant. But you see, in that pot is the living soul of a goblin child, and it belongs to you. Congratulations, she said, trying to keep the rising sarcasm out of her voice. That night, Sergeant Cullen dreamed he was in a cave with monsters chattering away at him in their dreadful lingo. He put it down to the beer, but it was funny the way he couldn't let the little glittering thing go. His fingers never quite managed it, however hard he tried.